Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the AI for Good Global Summit, always on, all year long. We hope that you, your family, your friends, and your colleagues are all keeping healthy and safe. My name is Fred Werner from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, and it's a privilege for me to be introducing today's webinar. Now, the ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information Communication Technologies, and we're also the organizers of the AI for Good Global Summit, hand in hand with X Prize Foundation and in partnership with 36 UN sister agencies, ACM, and co-convened with Switzerland. And the goal of the AI Summit is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the Sustainable Development Goals for global impact. And like much of the world, the summit has gone digital, and we're moving forward with weekly programming, allowing us to reach more people than ever before. And we're very pleased to introduce the first keynote of the webinar series, presented by Dr. Shwetak Patel. He's the Director of Health for Google. He's a professor at University of Washington, and he's the recipient of the very prestigious ACM Computing Prize. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Vicki Hansen, the CEO of ACM, for her tireless and longstanding support of the AI Summit, both as a partner and a gold sponsor, and without which none of this would have been possible today. So on behalf of the AI for Good team, we'd like to say a big thank you from the team. Thank you, Vicki. And I think I can even hear some virtual applause happening as we speak. So before I introduce today's moderator, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping issues. First of all, your microphone has been disabled, so please use the chat and Q&A function if you wish to communicate. It's the job of the moderator to identify and ask questions to the keynote, and we're counting on your active participation to have a very interactive session today. And speaking of being interactive, I have a first challenge for you. Can you please let us know where you're connecting from? Simply use the chat function and type in what country you're from or what city or wherever you're connecting from, and make sure you select chat to everyone. And let's see who's on board. I'll start. I'm connecting from Geneva, Switzerland. We have Denmark, UK, Washington, India, Kenya, Ankara, Portugal, India, Italy, Algeria, San Francisco, Singapore, Toronto, Berlin. Wow, I can't even keep up with all the cities and countries. And that's great. We truly have a global audience with us here today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Yannis Ioannidis, and he's a professor at the University of Athens. And he also leads the Athena Center for Innovation and Research. So Yannis, without further ado, the floor is all yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Fred. It's a great pleasure and honor to be moderating the first AI for Good keynote. It's a keynote sponsored by the Association of Computer Machinery, ACM, which is a global organization, the oldest and by far the largest organization of computing professionals, more than 100,000 members, serving researchers, educators, practitioners, and helping also policymakers with issues of computing. It's a great pleasure for ACM to have Shwetak Patel as the keynote. As it was said, he's a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Washington and also at Google. Besides the ACM Prize in Computing, Shwetak has received many awards, many fellowships, and his CV is long. It will take too long, but let me just mention MacArthur Fellowship, Sloan Fellowship, Microsoft Fellowship, World Economic Forum, Young Global Scientist Award, and so on. He's also an ACM Fellow, and he has founded 3 startup companies, all of them exited very successfully. Today's presentation is about how ubiquitous computing and the mobile phone can improve our approach to healthcare with special emphasis on the COVID-19 pandemic. So without further ado, we're all waiting for Shwetak to a great trip for the next 40-45 minutes. Shwetak, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Yannis. So I'll bring up my presentation here. All right. Thank you again, Yannis. Thank you, ITU. Thank you, AI for Good team. This is a great honor and pleasure. And thanks to the ACM for nominating me to give this keynote. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's amazing to see where everybody's from. This is just great to see the entire world here wanting to look at kind of the work that my lab has been doing for the last few years, in addition to just wanted to share some thoughts around the area of how the mobile phone can actually impact healthcare. So what I want to talk about today is, how do we look at the mobile phone these days, and how does the mobile phone play a role in healthcare? And right now, obviously, we're in the midst of a pretty unprecedented pandemic, and wanted to talk a little bit about how the work that we've done and how the community can start to look at how phones can be used for the current pandemic as well. So most of my talk will be focused on the intersection computing and healthcare, but also how AI and machine learning is playing a critical role to help enabling some of these applications in healthcare, where you can take some of the sensors on the phone and take them to the next level in terms of the kind of utility they can have in the healthcare space. So that's where I'll spend most of my time. But before I do that, I just wanted to give everyone an overview of my research in general. So I myself as a computer scientist, but even as a computer scientist, I'm a very applied researcher, in the sense that I typically use computer science and machine learning and sensors and those as tools to solve socially meaningful problems. So a lot of my earlier work when I joined the faculty at the University of Washington, and even when I was a graduate student, was a lot around activity recognition, energy monitoring, sustainability. So I did a lot of work in how to use machine learning and AI to help people better understand their energy and water usage. So a lot of work in sustainability. I've been doing healthcare research from the start of my PhD, where a lot of the work that I've done in machine learning and sensors have been applied for things like elder care, remote monitoring. So healthcare is just such a complicated space that it takes many years to have impact in that space. So you have to kind of persevere through it. So I've been doing a lot of work in healthcare. As Giannis mentioned, so one of my areas of focus is also ubiquitous computing. So I've looked at different ways of how do we build new sensors that are truly ubiquitous. So sensors that could be deployed in an environment where you don't have to worry about retrieving them to replace their batteries, or having to go connect it to a power source. So how do you build sensors that are low power, wireless, that can give you this longevity, but also the breadth of deployment. So looked at a number of different solutions around low power wireless sensors. And also, if you think about computing these days, just like what I'm going to be talking about on the mobile phone for healthcare, the phone is one of the most ubiquitous computing platforms out there. And so, with a small device like a phone, interacting with it gets very difficult compared to a traditional keyboard or mouse. So my group and I have also looked at a number of different emerging interaction techniques to be able to interact with a device that is something of that size, and looking at different input modalities, looking at gesture interaction, voice interaction. So looking at how do we expand the vocabulary of interacting with a computing platform. So this is my research has been fairly broad, but a lot of the work that we've been doing is very applied, and looking at problem-driven research, where we look at particular areas of emphasis and then and use computing as tools to solve those. But today, what I really want to focus on is something that I've been doing for over a decade now, which is looking at how do we build computing technologies to address the need for personal health monitoring. And what I mean by personal health monitoring is that if you think about the healthcare industry right now, or healthcare technologies, a lot of it is really based around general population information. And what that means is, what I mean by that is, you have statistics on, the trend of something happening. Either, maybe there's a regional statistics around the infection rate of influenza or maybe coronavirus. But then there's also this personal component to it, where some people might be more at risk. Some people have certain risk factors that others might not have. Some people might be exposed to certain things that others might not have. So the ability to monitor physiologically your personal well-being is really important in the healthcare space, but that's very tough. We don't have a mobile hospital with us everywhere, or a clinic with us. Right now the model is you go to a clinic or a hospital, but what would it mean if you had the technology with you? And my personal hypothesis, and I think an emerging hypothesis, is given that the larger portion of the world, mobile is starting to become more and more ubiquitous platform. How do we start to pull some of that into mobile phones? And so that's really the crux of this talk. A lot of people talk about why is a computer scientist doing so much healthcare work? I often like to point out that I've been honored to be the recipient of the ACM Prize in Computing. The highest honor that ACM provides is the Turing Award, and it's just interesting to point out that at a couple of points in the last maybe couple of years, Alan Turing's most cited paper was actually a biology and health paper. And this is something that a lot of people don't realize. Often they forget about, they all remember the computer science impact that he's had. But this paper on morphogenesis, which is basically this concept of, how do identical cells differentiate into different things, and physiologically stripes and legs and tails, and so he had a theoretical underpinning on how that happened, how that happens from a chemistry standpoint, and it turned out that that was a very fundamental basis in biology and bioscience and even in health. And so it's just interesting to point out that the top prize that bears the name Turing, actually one of the most cited papers is actually a health and biology paper. So just something to think about, that, computer science can have an impact anywhere. Computer science is such a powerful tool, if harnessed very effectively and in the right ways, can have a huge impact. And healthcare is an area that I encourage a lot of you to really consider in computer science as a place to have impact. The thing about healthcare that's really fascinating is that if you look at the paradigm shifts, they've all been enabled by very interesting phenomenon in society. Right now we're in an unprecedented pandemic with the coronavirus, and some of the things that you can see in healthcare were actually initiated because of major pandemics. When you have a pandemic, you have the entire community galvanizing around what's going on there to try to see what you can do to address those issues. It's unfortunate that it often takes a pandemic to do this, but pandemics have actually trailblazed a lot of innovative work in healthcare. If you look at vaccines, when you think about polio or vaccines that were being developed over the course of time, where innovation around vaccine development has been even more recently spurred by innovations in computing. The coronavirus, if you look at how the vaccine is being developed, very unprecedented ways that these studies are being done and how computing is playing a role. Treatment. Think about the HIV pandemic, where we went from this pandemic, now we're starting to have treatment where people can benefit from these very complicated treatments, but these treatments have been advanced because of some of the original pandemics that had hit many parts of the world and continue to hit many parts of the world, unfortunately, but at least there are treatments that are starting to be developed there. Surgical robotics or manipulation, looking at how surgeries are now safer, and you can do these in outpatient settings. You can do these in ways where it's very not as invasive and a lot safer. Imaging, medical imaging has been revolutionized because of AI and computer vision, being able to interpret, diagnose, and screen images that is typically human overread, but AI techniques can help identify things that maybe a human may miss, or maybe assist an individual to be able to interpret or overread an image. And so those things have all been pushed by either major technological advances or paradigm shifts that have happened because of pandemics or major conditions that have been arising in society. Another one that I'd like to point out is point of care diagnostics. It has been a major paradigm shift in healthcare as well. And what I mean by point of care diagnostics is that the notion that when you go to a clinic or a hospital, that at that moment you can get a diagnosis. So instead of doing an exam and then maybe having a chest x-ray or a blood draw and then sending off to a lab, maybe a few days later, maybe a week later, you get a result back. The fact that there are machines at the time of the clinical encounter, you can actually get a diagnosis, was revolutionary. The fact that you can go into a clinic, you can get a mammogram, or you can get, in this case, an ultrasound, and to see the wellness of a fetal, or you can get the fetal heart rate to see the wellness of a baby at the moment that somebody's getting that care, just changed how you would diagnose disease and what you could do from that point onward. So that is one major area of innovation in healthcare that's really caused a major paradigm shift. Right now, we're actually in the midst of a very unique paradigm shift, which is basically this whole other area of mobile devices and sensors and wearables with the intersection of AI and machine learning and signal processing, where pushing the boundaries on what current computing platforms can do with low-cost, ubiquitous sensors and machine learning and AI to basically push the boundaries on what you can do with healthcare outside the four walls of the hospital is another major paradigm shift we're in the middle of right now. The coronavirus has actually accelerated a lot of this work, which I'll talk about in a second. So if you look at the example here, this is a pulse oximeter that's connected to the microphone of a microphone jack of a smartphone, just to do remote monitoring. You have the computational power in the phone already. You potentially already have network capabilities, and you have a user interface. So the only thing really left is an external sensor that you connect to this. Now you have something that may be as akin to a clinical device. And so this whole paradigm shift of using mobile as a way to compute, display, and transmit sensor and physiological data changes the game in terms of healthcare, especially how you administer it outside of the four walls of the hospital or the clinic. And on top of that, you've got this whole plethora of technology that are being developed on the wearable side. So if you think about heart rate monitors, pulse oximeters, looking at activity trackers, ECG, EKG, breathing monitors, looking at gait analysis to prevent falls or detect the onset of a potential fall hazard, you're starting to see sensor technology starting to be embedded into one's daily life. This is all fairly new right now, but it starts to really change the way that we think about healthcare. And so what does this really mean? Why bring healthcare to the mobile space? One of the things that we're already seeing in the pandemic right now is that telemedicine usage is just expanding dramatically, which has enabled remote care monitoring. The fact that you don't necessarily need to go to the clinic or in the hospital, where you can do a lot of these virtual care visits remotely, has really changed the way that you administer care. The timeliness, the convenience, and also the frequency at which you can interact with a professional. The other thing is that mobile devices, because they're with you and they're so personal, and mobile devices are things that, if you forget the device at home, you will more than likely go get it to basically use it for that day, because a lot of people, you need that just for your daily activities in terms of being able to do your work, being able to keep up with the family, being able to just operate in that day. That's a device that people will likely have with them. And so you can use this as an opportunity to drive screening. So for the coronavirus, if there are new guidelines that come out, or if there's things that you want to have somebody do, where you might have a checklist or might want to do a triage, you can push these to the phones, and the phone will be with them. They might not have a pulse oximeter or may not have other devices, but at least the phone could be a broker or at least a first source of information. It also pushes the boundary on how we develop new diagnostics. We're not beholden to just the things you can do in the clinic. We can actually start to do things that are more longitudinal, looking at things over time, changes over time, to be able to diagnose or treat disease. And also improvement in treatment. Now we have more real-time feedback from the individual, so that it's not just beholden to maybe every 1 week or 6 months or every 1 year where one might see a medical professional. Here you have more continuous interaction or physiological access to one's information, so that you can start to make more real-time assessment in terms of changing or updating treatment. And I mentioned this before, continuous monitoring and continuous measurement is this notion that you have more physiological data from the individual to make a better judgment in terms of how treatment is going or the onset of disease before you have disease. So one of the things that is top of mind for a lot of health researchers is, how do you get to a prediction of a diagnostic or predict disease before you're symptomatic or you're asymptomatic? So what would it mean if you could diagnose or screen for coronavirus before you're symptomatic? Because a lot of times when you're not symptomatic, you're still a spreader. You can still infect others. Influenza is the same. Before you're symptomatic, you're still can expose other people. Your infectivity capabilities are fairly high, even pre-symptom. But also personally, by the time you're symptomatic for a lot of diseases, the treatments are much more complicated. So by looking at longitudinal continuous data, you have this possibility to be able to pattern match and say that, hey, there's something different going on here over this course of this year than normally in your body. Now let's start to get at some of these tests that we can do before you're symptomatic or before condition starts to worsen. And the mobile phone has been has played an important role in a lot of these, in the healthcare space in general. And a lot of these tools that we've seen out there have mainly been data collection apps. Or one of the canonical ones are food journaling for weight loss or just general nutrition, where you enter the information about what you've eaten, how much you've exercised, and you have a food journal or log. And a lot of these things are manually inputted. And there's also different technologies out there where you can use the phone as a journal. But one of the things that that's happening is with the modern smartphone, or even the smartphone of just 5 years ago, or even the phone 7 years ago, are very capable. And if you think about the mobile phone penetration worldwide, we're starting to get to phone penetrations at the order of 3-4 billion phones in the world, even more than that, depending on how you lump a smartphone to a feature phone. But if you look at what's in a phone, you have a camera, flash, you have a touch screen that's capacitive, you've got accelerometer, gyros, multiple microphones, multiple speakers. Some of the newer phones have IR projectors. But often we take these sensors for granted, where we use it for telephony, maybe use it for gaming, maybe and often use it for photography. But these sensors are fairly capable, especially when you look at machine learning and AI and signal processing as a layer to start to interpret what you can get from these sensors, that these are things that are already with many people. And how do we leverage those sensors for healthcare has really been the crux of the work that I've been doing, and now the community has been doing. There's been a lot of work that has been developed beyond just my lab now, that is looking at how do you use existing sensors on mobile phones for health monitoring. And what I mean by existing sensors is that, yes, you can attach a device to a phone, but what I mean here is that how do you use the sensors that are already on the phone for doing health monitoring? This could be the speaker, the microphone, or even some of the more emerging sensors that you might see on there. Accelerometer, gyros are pretty much on every phone, but now you start to see other kinds of sensors like NFC or other kinds of radios on there. So how do you start to leverage those for physiological monitoring, really pushing the envelope with what you could do with these sensors? And the goal is that you don't have to be perfect. You have to just have enough of an insight to know what to do next. So you don't have to make these things perfectly accurate or as good as a clinical device that you might have in a hospital, but how do you have just enough confidence that this can give you information to triage an individual, so a precursor to what you might actually do as a diagnostic, so you know what path that an individual can take. And so we've been working on a number of different technologies. I can't talk about all of them today, but I'll just give you a little bit of a taste of the kinds of things that we've done. We've done work in the pulmonary space, looking at using the microphone for cough assessment, lung assessment, even blood screening, looking at using the camera and flash on assessing how much hemoglobin is in the blood, bilirubin in the baby, in newborns and babies, cardiovascular disease, so looking at SpO2 monitoring using the camera and flash, blood pressure monitoring using pulse transit time, using the sensors that are already on the phone, technology around sleep, osteoporosis, and I welcome anybody to go to our lab website at the University of Washington to take a look at any of these papers. But I'll give you kind of a little bit of an overview on a variety of these different technologies and how well they work and the impact that they can have on healthcare, and also some of the impact that they're having on the current pandemic. So the first technology I want to talk to you about is something that we did as one of the first technologies that we had built for monitoring lung function. And this is very relevant right now. If you think about the coronavirus, which is a respiratory ailment that you have to monitor very closely, especially people that might be at risk, that might have asthma, a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Monitoring your lungs are very important in that case. And measuring lung function is typically done by a technique called spirometry. So, if you have cardiovascular or heart disease, you might get an EKG or echocardiogram. In the lung space, you get a spirometry measurement. And spirometry is basically a measurement of how much air you can push out over a certain period of time to get assessment of how well are your lungs doing. Are there fluids in the lungs? Are the lungs not as efficient? Are there other things happening? And as the lung function drops, pulmonologists typically use this as a screener or diagnosis to basically take a step. What do you do next? So on the bottom left is an example of a clinical spirometer. These are fairly big machines. There's a tube in it. You put your mouth over the tube, you blow it hard as possible. The machine records the airflow. That's typically what's used in the clinic. The one in the middle is a digital version of that. That's a device that's a little bit smaller, has a computer inside of it. The one on the far left is roughly about a $10,000 US device. The one in the middle is about a $2,000 device. And then the one on the right, we're starting to see more and more of these home spirometers, which might be $100 or $200 US, but still fairly expensive. But the thing is that if you have asthma, you don't really know when you're going to have an asthma attack. You might kind of learn the pre-signals about what might be happening, but you might not have the spirometer with you. You might not have the device with you. Or in the case of coronavirus, if you want to monitor post-infection, how your lungs doing, well, there's not a technology out there to do that. Or if you're in a remote space where you might have telemedicine, how do I do a lung function if I can't go to the clinic? So what we developed was a technology that could use the phone. But before I go into that, the kind of thing that you want to just keep in mind is the thing that pulmonologists care about is that you really care about volume and flow. So, and typically what they look at is this curve where, you have restriction where you might have the scooping look to your flow volume curve, or you might have restriction where it doesn't go up to the high level peak for your particular age and weight. And so pulmonologists need these curves. And a lot of these home spirometers don't even have that. They might have one of the metrics that might be relevant, but the pulmonologist needs to have all the metrics available. So some of the existing devices didn't quite do that. And so what we wanted to do was develop a phone-based tool that just used the microphone. So no additional hardware. Just think about the barrier. If you had to plug another device in, you might as well have a dedicated device in a lot of those cases. Was to how do we use the microphone as a signal or as a sensor to be able to assess how much air or air that one is blowing out in the same way that you would do in a clinical spirometer, but do it with a mobile phone. And so that's what we developed. So this is an app that basically hold the phone in front of you. You blow at the face of the phone. So in this case, some of you may or may not be able to see this video, but you blow at the face of the phone. There's a visualization that shows that, are you blowing hard enough? Because this is very technique dependent because you got to get all the air out. And then there's a visualization that shows, yep, there's still more air in the lungs, still more air in the lungs. And then when you're done, it gives you a flow volume curve. And you can either read this out to a clinician, you can send it to them, you can text message it to them. But the idea is you can do a phone-based spirometry maneuver. So how does this work? So traditional spirometers use a flow sensor. So a flow sensor is just a turbine. And basically you have a little orifice, you have a sensor in it, which might be a little turbine. As you blow inside of it, the thing spins faster and faster. The faster it spins, the more air is going through, and you just integrate that over time. So that's the example on the thing on the left. There's some more advanced flow sensors that don't have a turbine. They're called pneumatacs, which is much more of has less obstruction. The intake of a car, in the intake flow sensor for the internal combustion engine in a car uses a flow sensor. It's a little wire that heats up, and as air moves across it, it cools down, and that tells you how much flow goes through it. So there's lots of different ways to do flow sensing. But in our case, we only have a microphone, and a microphone is technically an uncalibrated pressure sensor. And so how do we turn this uncalibrated pressure sensor that's basically designed to just pick up sound waves into a flow meter? And that's what we basically started to work on. And it turned out we actually stumbled across a technique that we could use that was being used in the speech recognition community for years, where in the speech recognition community, the vocal tract resonances that are happening. So if you want to analyze my speech or transcribe my speech or my sound, the vocal tract resonances that come through were actually causing issues and noise problems with the actual speech recognition algorithms themselves. And so there was a long history of developing filters that would cancel out the resonance. But if you look at the physiology, when you're blowing air out, the obstructions are happening in the pulmonary system. So what would happen is when you have some type of obstruction, the vocal tract resonances would actually change. So in fact, the human body can be the sensor. You don't need an external sensor. The resonances were actually very much related to the pulmonary system itself. So we found that, so in a lot of the research and literature, we took a problem that was a issue for speech recognition, turned the problem on its head and said, hey, that thing that was causing problems for speech recognition, we can actually use that for health sensing because that's actually telling you a lot about the physiology. So why don't we take it from that perspective? So that's how we actually developed some of these algorithms. So we created this vocal tract model, and we actually went back to the original literature. This is the old Flanagan model of speech recognition. So a lot of you speech recognition folks out there may actually recognize some of this. But really, it's this physical model that you can create from the glottis, the vocal tract, and the mouth when air is coming out of it. This is work that the computer science communities, the the speech recognition community, even the medical communities have these models around how air flows and how the mouth creates this resonance that creates sound. And so what we did was we actually modeled the vocal tract. And this is actually a 3D printed vocal tract. We actually created a 3D model of how air flows through if you had a restriction. So let's say you have, a musical instrument, and as you change the properties of that musical instrument in terms of adding or removing a mass within that track, it changes the sound. And that's essentially what we did. We tried to create a model where as the vocal tract resonances are changing, it turned out that in our clinical data collection, that resonance changes is proportional to the actual flow coming out of it. You have to normalize it based on the height and weight of the individual, because you got to kind of get a sense of the size of the pulmonary system. But that's what model that we used was basically a statistical model that basically predicted that. But now we've actually moved beyond that, and we're actually using deep learning models. And I'll talk about how we've been collecting the data on that in a second. But one of the things we did early on was that not everybody has a smartphone. And how do we enable 5 billion phones or 4 billion phones? How many phones are out there in the world to be able to do this? So we actually developed the technology in 2 ways. One was using an app on a phone where you get the best audio data possible, and then a phone, any ordinary phone in the world. So this is a feature for not a smartphone, but a regular phone that that doesn't have many apps on it. You can't actually download an app easily on it, but you can make a call. So one of the things that we did was created a version where you could make a phone call to a toll-free number, and then you would do the maneuver the same way. In that case, we had to analyze the data that goes from the speaker all the way through the telephony network, through the GSM tower, through the transcontinental fiber line or the oceanic line, or maybe it's going through the satellite connection, really looking at how that data gets mangled and gets to the endpoint. And it turns out from the mu-law encoding and the way the encoders work, it actually preserved just enough of that sound that's created when you make that blowing maneuver that we could still reconstruct some of this. It's not as accurate as a phone app, but this would actually allow you to do it in such a way that you can call any toll-free number and it text messages you back the results. So you can use any ordinary phone in the world, literally turning any phone in the world into a pulmonary assessment tool. So this is something we did early on. And bottom right is an example where we deployed this technology in Bangladesh to collect some of the data, doing the validation, and having clinics where you might only have one pulmonologist in a particular region, and you have many, many patients that need to go a very long way to see that pulmonologist. Now you could do this in the villages and have community health workers just deploy some of these in their respective communities and villages. So we did a very large clinical study of about 10,000 patients around the world, where we took a clinical grade $10,000 clinical spirometer and the app to see how well does this work. And so if you look here, PEF, FEV1, FEC, those are just the numbers. Those are numbers that that pulmonologists care about. So what's really relevant here is the percentage error from a clinical device. And it turns out a lot of these measures, even if you use the phone app or even the local recording, which is just basically the telephone call, you have errors in the, about 5 to 10%. And to put that into context, most of these FDA, the Food and Drug Administration clearance for a lot of these spirometers is within 5 or 10%. So when you do a spirometry test and you do another one, you already have a 5% variation from test to test. So if you think about this, even if you had a 10 or 15% error, if you're just thinking about, healthy lung function, moderate, or you see a change in that you're getting a downward trajectory, that already is good enough for triaging. So let alone that this is already very close to a clinical device. So that we're actually approaching clinical device accuracy numbers. But for a triage tool, you actually don't need to show anybody the numbers. You just have to say that, hey, if you're doing this test once a week or once a day, if you see you go down the threshold, if you have a downward trajectory, that's what would elicit a secondary step. But if things are looking normal, then you can keep just doing the test, but now we can start to triage people that are actually having a decline and start to push more of our resources to those individuals. So even as a screening tool, this would be really helpful. So this gives you a sense that these things can actually work fairly well when you compare them to a clinical device, but it's really enabled by the theoretical models, from the physics model to the sensor innovation that was required and the machine learning work that was required there. So some similar work that we did related to this was to study cough. So cough is often a common symptom that people often talk about, but from a healthcare standpoint, people often don't give it much thought, because coughing is a symptom in a lot of things, right? Pulmonologists or medical professionals are always like, coughs, what do you do with a cough? Everybody's coughing. But one of the things that we've been looking at is that, hey, the human ear can't really differentiate a lot of things about a cough. When somebody's coughing in the room, a lot of times we don't even notice that. So if you ask somebody to self-report how often they cough, if they have a pulmonary disease, they grossly underestimate. Typically, somebody that coughs maybe 100 times an hour may say, oh, I only cough 2 or 3 times, because you got to tune that out. But a machine learning algorithm or a microphone won't tune that out. There's things that human ears may not pick up, whereas a machine learning algorithm could pick up. So our hypothesis was that, hey, human ears may miss some of these subtle characteristics, whereas in computer vision, an image, there's only so much you can do with image processing, but because of the resolution of the camera, what may or may not be in the scene, but the visual processing that one could do on an image is greatly surpasses what you can do with a computer vision algorithm. But in the human ears, there's a different situation here where there's these subtle characteristics that don't even get captured, because you're just kind of canceling and tuning them out. So the idea here was that there might be some more entropy in cough than we think. And so let's study that. So we developed these techniques that are actually starting to be used now with coronavirus, where cough is a major symptom of this. Where we looked at first is, let's use that same glottis model and start to create a cough model from it. Now, instead of doing spirometry, let's identify cough. What is cough? A cough is this only 300 millisecond thing that happens where you have this, you inhale, and then you have this really large explosive event that happens where you have this cough event. And it happens about 200 to 300 milliseconds long. You have this burst period, and then you have this round off. So as you see on the spectrogram, time on the x-axis, and then you have frequency, and the intensity of the color change is basically how much energy is in that band. And you have this drop off. And it turns out there's actually a pretty unique signature for a cough. So if you just wanted to identify a cough, you can actually do that fairly accurately compared to throat clearing, speech, background noise, car banging, backfiring sounds, car sounds, doors opening and closing. You can actually fairly accurately identify a cough, which could actually potentially be useful. In the medical space, there wasn't really technology that can actually quantify cough. So we had to develop that first before you could do anything deeper. But if you look at the signal, there's some entropy here. And if you start to look closely at it, when somebody coughs, that could tell you a lot about the physiology. Is it a dry cough, wet cough? Potentially, one of the things that's happening in the computer science community right now is, could you diagnose or screen coronavirus from the cough? I think that's going to be very difficult, because coronaviruses can be, an influenza cough or a pneumonia cough might sound the same, but the fact that you have something happening might be a good signal. So could you identify wet versus dry, or precursor to potentially something that could be something like a coronavirus, like an upper respiratory infection? You could do, but the first is to identify if you can find the cough accurately. So one of the things that we focused on early on was not just coughs for cough's sake, was really looking at it for a particular condition, which was tuberculosis. So we worked very closely with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to see, could we use our cough algorithms to help identify and study tuberculosis, which is a highly infectious lung disease. In fact, a lot of things in TB parallel the coronavirus. It's infectious. Coughing is a major symptom. We're still trying to figure out how it spreads. Is it community transmission? It probably is, but do you have a super spreader? Is it one individual spreading a lot, or is everybody spreading? How do the particles stay? How long do they stay in the air? What kind of humidity, temperature causes the particles to stay suspended? There's a lot of parallels there. So we actually looked at studying tuberculosis and cough as a way to say, how can we do maybe public health assessment? How do we know if there's a super spreader? How do we know if there's a lot of coughing? Could be an indicator for tuberculosis, or even personal health monitoring. If I had a way to monitor my cough in the evenings or maybe throughout the day, am I doing better now at post-infection of TB? So one of the things we had to do was collect data here. And so we worked with the Gates Foundation and University of Cape Town to deploy some of our technologies in this cough box that they had developed, which is a little box that you go inside of, you close it up, and these are people that are infected with, that already have tuberculosis. They go in there. This thing is obviously disinfected every time somebody goes in there, but there's an impactor in there that can capture the particles. So when the particles are analyzed, in fact that there's TB particles that were captured from the cough. There's obviously a microphone in there for our own assessment. There's a number of different devices in there, but you capture the cough, you capture the particle, and from the chest X-ray and the particles, you know for sure that they have TB or not. And that's how we were able to collect a lot of the data early on. And if you look at tuberculosis, a healthy lung on the left here is basically you don't have any holes or these granulomas. But when you have an infection like tuberculosis, the infection is hit by, you've got your white blood cells attacking it. And then you've got these granulomas that form, which are basically these little holes that show up on a chest X-ray. And the idea here is that, hey, if I'm coughing with a healthy lung versus a TB lung, my cough has to sound different, even though if I can't hear it differently, from an algorithmic standpoint or machine learning and AI standpoint, it has to look different because you're completely changing the airflow of how the origination happens, how the flow is coming out. It's just inherently from the physics, there has to be a change. But how do we identify the change? That's the hard part. So these are some of the things that we've been looking at now, and some of the community has been looking at is, in addition to identifying the cough, when you zoom into that waveform, there is a signature that you can start to look at where if it's wet or dry. And also, if you look at the last 50 milliseconds, that's when the voice comes through. So you can actually start to identify is it one cougher or another cougher. So some of the work that we've done is identifying not only is it a cough, but clustering, saying, hey, that cough that we just heard is different from this other cough. So you can start to do these privacy preserving techniques on device, where in an environment, you can start to see what the infectivity rate of an environment is without having to send any data to the cloud. You just locally process that and cluster how many different individuals might have been infected. Or you can have a personalized device, which is something for you to monitor your own rates. And so some of the algorithms that we've developed, especially around cough identification, are starting to get better and better over time. So if you think about the false positive rate, you don't want to have this technique say that people are coughing when they're not coughing. So you need to have this really high true positive rate. You got to really know that somebody, when there's a cough, it's actually a cough. So you don't over predict some of these things. And so some of these convolutional neural nets, these CNNs, are actually starting to outperform some of our traditional SVMs that we had worked on in the past, these 4 vector machines. And so if you start to look at sensitivity specificity, you can start to get to less than 10 or 5% or even 1% false positive rates with accuracies that are above 85%, which is well above self-report, And these are just using commodity microphones. So this gives you a sense of how some of the AI work has actually accelerated some of the capabilities of how you can do this kind of assessment. So some of the things that we're doing and some of the things that the community is now starting to come around with coronavirus is starting to look at post-infection. So now, we've got so many people affected, but post-infection, how are we going to triage post-infection care? So after you've been infected, you still have to assess one's lung function, especially if somebody was at risk. So are you doing better or not? And how do we do that at a large scale? We just can't have everybody come back to the hospital because the clinics are overwhelmed with the diagnostic cases. How about the post-infection cases? So some of the tools that we've been building is tools on the phone where you can have the phone that's night side. You can put it next to your bedside, where in the evening, that's a good time to start to monitor how often you're coughing or not, because sometimes pulmonary exacerbations or something that might arise may happen at night. And so if you see a cough frequency is going up, where often a co-sleeper or yourself might not know how things are going or how you're breathing. So you can start to do this assessment and say, hey, this is getting worse. Now you can call a nurse case manager or a community health worker to see what's to do next. And then a community health worker can monitor all the patients to say, hey, these people are doing okay. Oh, hey, I'm seeing a little bit more trending here. Let me check in on them. So instead of calling everybody, now you can check in on ones that have the emergent cases, because it's the ones that now you can automatically triage. So you can actually use machine learning here to triage automatically as well. So this is just an example where we did this for TB, but all of that is being applied for coronavirus and COVID right now. So this is another tool that we've built, not as relevant to coronavirus, but just wanted to talk about a couple examples on non-invasive blood screening. So we talked about microphones, everything you do with and there's a lot more you can do with microphones. I just talked about 2 examples, but what can you do with the camera? The cameras are getting better and better. You can start to do amazing photography with these cameras. And you can capture amazing pictures, and the technology in the camera is getting so much better. But what can you do it from a health standpoint? So we've been looking at how do we use the camera and the flash that are also getting better for non-invasive blood screening. So one of the first areas we looked at was newborn jaundice. So newborn jaundice is basically, when a baby is born, one of the things that you monitor is the amount of bilirubin that's in the blood. This is pretty important. Bilirubins typically may increase when a baby is born right after birth, where their body starting to still adapt, where blood cells, you have blood cells that are developed and blood cells, red blood cells that die, they get garbage collected, so to speak, and that garbage collection process is starting to be developed in the body for a newborn, and so sometimes they don't develop fast enough, and so you have these dead blood cells that are still starting to back up in the body, and what happens is the baby turns yellow. That's one of the symptomatic signs, but this can actually have debilitating impact. It can have neurological impact, and this is a case for newborn mortality, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, in developing countries in particular. In developed countries, this is tested for. The moment the baby is born, it's monitored at the moment of birth, before the baby is discharged from the hospital. In many parts of the world where you don't have birth in a hospital, where you might have a midwife, this might not even be tested for. So we are looking at how do we develop a technology that uses the phone where you can take a picture of a baby to see how much bilirubin is in the blood. Because it physically manifests itself in the skin, you can optically analyze the amount of bilirubin because you can see the yellowness. The problem is that when you ask a parent, is your baby yellow or not, it's really hard to do that. For darker pigmented babies, they don't look yellow, or they don't look yellower. Or even if you had a baby that looks yellow, it's hard to know. It's like, did they look more yellow than yesterday? It's just so hard to do visual assessment. So what we wanted to do was create a tool that could do that automatically. Right now, the way that bilirubin is assessed is that you do a blood draw. So it's called total serum bilirubin. You take a little bit of blood, you analyze it. They make these non-invasive devices too. This is a device that you put on the forehead of a baby, and it uses an optical technique. It shines a couple of different frequencies of light and looks at the absorption and reflection of certain frequencies to see how much bilirubin is at the subcutaneous level of the skin. So basically the capillaries and the vessels that are right below the skin, it just looks at the color that being absorbed and reflected to infer bilirubin. These devices are fairly expensive. These are about maybe $5,000+, and they're not very ubiquitous at all. It's a very specialized device that's not deployed massively. And because we knew that there was a device that could be done or used in a non-invasive way, we basically said, could we just do this on a phone? It's got a flash and it got a camera. Could we use machine learning with those sensors to do this? And the reason why bilirubin is an interesting one to look at is that bilirubin starts to peak after babies have typically been discharged from a hospital, or after a midwife has actually delivered the baby. So typically you're outside the care of a professional when bilirubins are at the highest peak, where you need to monitor them. So in the United States, after a baby is discharged after a day or two from the clinic or the hospital, then a parent has to monitor, say, hey, are the kids' bilirubin going up? I don't know. We don't have a blood. How do I know? I have to look at them. And so a tool that you could do at home, especially for developing countries where you don't have a blood draw, you can have a nurse case manager or a community health worker start to do this assessment. And so the way this works is that it turns out bilirubin absorbs this blue light. So if you look at the wavelength, the absorption probability of bilirubin, you've got this peak here, which is basically where if you have high amounts of bilirubin, you have this like 460, 470 nanometer light source that actually gets absorbed. And so here what we said was, hey, a modern phone has a white flash, a pretty broadband flash. So if we know the properties of the flash, and if we took a picture of the baby with the flash, we could look at how much ambient light we had before we took a picture. We know we can have the phone close enough so that you blanch the skin with the flash, or you kind of wash the skin out, and we can look at how much light is absorbed and reflected compared to a healthy baby with low bilirubin. You can start to see how much blue light's absorbed. This is very similar to that non-invasive device, but here we're doing it in a non-contact way. In this example on the far top left, we have a calibration card. So the idea here is to calibrate the camera, because every camera has a different property in terms of its white balance, and it might have different correction factors that are built into the hardware, but it's just to calibrate the camera as a reference, maybe ambient light to calibrate. So, but most of the work is done by the phone here. And what we did was we basically created an algorithm that essentially identified where this peak happened. And so our algorithm, we did a clinical, we've actually done more babies than this, but in our initial trial of about 500 plus babies, where we took a blood draw of a newborn and used the phone app to collect the data, compared to the blood draw, BillyCam had a 0.91 correlation to the actual blood draw. The TCB device is that non-invasive device I showed earlier, which is 0.92. So this tool is almost as good as a regulated, a clinical non-invasive device. And if you look at the bland Altman plot at the bottom, if you look at the level, the spread, we're within the spread of what the transcutaneous device or the non-invasive device could do. So it's roughly within the same ballpark of where the clinical device would operate when you when you compare that to a blood draw. And as I said earlier, you don't have to be perfect. Even if you could provide a warning signal saying that, hey, we're in the downward trajectory, or we're seeing a high amounts of bilirubin, or we're not seeing a reduction in bilirubin, that's already an important indicator that doesn't even happen right now. So this is an example of how to use a camera and flash to potentially get at some of that. I won't go into detail here, but one of the areas after we had published this paper, a number of folks had reached out to us and said, hey, there's this thing about bilirubin in adults. You don't see the yellowing happening in adults because, the bilirubins are very minute. They change very little. And so you don't manifest it as a color change. But what happens is in pancreatic cancer, bilirubin does increase. And pancreatic cancer has a 5-year survival rate of only like about 6%. And that's because people don't know that they have it until they're symptomatic. And by the time you're symptomatic, it's often too late. You're in advanced stages. So if you could screen somebody much earlier, the prognosis could actually be very different. You could actually do things like a Whipple procedure or medical procedures that can maybe help somebody sooner, but you don't know until you're symptomatic. But one of the things that we were looking at is that in the eyes, in an adult with pancreatic cancer, the white parts of your eye, the sclera, actually get just a little bit yellow. And so we created a protocol where you could do a selfie type picture in a study where we wanted to see, could we identify bilirubin, not in kids, but in adults, and see if jaundice is increasing. And so these are some preliminary results, but we were actually able to get some fairly accurate results in terms of seeing a trend where your bilirubins are okay and they're starting to go up. And if you are at risk for pancreatic cancer, you potentially could use this as a home screening tool to see what might be happening. So this could be a selfie you can take, or you just take a picture maybe once a month or once, and this is still very early work, but these are things that we've been looking at where right now we do it with a controlled box just so we can control light. But this is an area we can start to get at a potential diagnostic or screen that how else would you have done it without being symptomatic or doing a blood draw at home. So these are some other areas that the community's been looking at. Another technology that we've been developing is hemoglobin. So hemoglobin in the blood. So this is relevant for pretty much anybody, for people with sickle cell anemia, people that are anemic, pregnant women, just anybody where you want to monitor your hemoglobin levels. Right now it's done with a blood draw, but similarly to bilirubin, there's a spectral property that can be leveraged where you can actually start to do blood assessment. And so the way this works is you take your finger, put it over the camera and flash. So the flash turns on, and then you put your finger over that. There's a lot of apps actually you can download now that gives you your heart rate, which it looks at the cardiac volume changes. So basically but what this does, it actually looks at the different frequencies of light in the RGB channel on the camera to figure out hemoglobin levels, not just your heart rate. It can capture your heart rate, obviously. And we know that you actually have a finger there when we see the heartbeat, but then it gives you in grams per deciliter what your hemoglobin levels are through an optical assessment. So similarly to the bilirubin device, there's actually a device called the Pronto device from Massimo, which is a clip-on device that can do it non-invasively. So we knew that the hypothesis had some legs there because there is a non-invasive customized optical technique you can use to do this, which there are devices out there that can do it. The way this works is that, hemoglobin, which is basically the amount of So in the blood, you have basically hemoglobin and plasma, or water that's in your blood. So really what you care about is the percentage of hemoglobin and plasma. So how much hemoglobin is in there. And it turns out the color is a good proxy for this too. The more red it is, the more hemoglobin you have than plasma. And so if you look at on the absorption wavelength, just like bilirubin for hemoglobin, plasma is about 500 nanometers, or water, and then you've got the absorption rate is very high. And then you have this hemoglobin, which is a little bit lower, and it starts to dip a little bit faster than plasma. If you start to identify two different wavelengths on that curve, you can start to do the ratio between the plasma and the hemoglobin. So we care about how much hemoglobin is in the blood as a ratio of plasma. So you can essentially look at the colorness if you wanted to. It's called hemochrome analysis. And so you shine light at it, you look at how much light is reflected and absorbed, just like in the bilirubin technique. In this case, we put the finger up against the camera because it's a lot harder to see these subtle changes. So you have to really push it up against it. So, but you can, if you know the light source in the wavelength, and you know how much is absorbed with and without a finger, then you can start to do that. But the challenge here is that, how do you know that you're taking the skin tone versus the blood into account? So if some of you may or may not be able to see this, but when you put your finger over the camera and you record a video, you will slowly see your heartbeat. You will actually see the throbbing. It's just the cardiac volume. When your heart beats, as that volume of blood gets to your fingertip, you see the volume change and increase and decrease as the blood is flowing through. And that's basically your heartbeat. So what we do is, because we can see the heartbeat through the finger, we know when there is a change because of the blood, because the blood was flowing, versus the skin color, which is not going to change that rapidly. So we can do the differential from the blood contributed color change versus just the natural color change of the finger. So that's what we do. So we look at the resting, the heartbeat, and look at resting again. So we can do the analysis before, during, and after the heart is beating in that waveform. And then we can cancel out the tissue from the blood there. So again, we did a clinical evaluation. The Pronto device is a clinical device that's a non-invasive. It's a little bit harder to do, so the correlation is a little bit lower than BiliCams, it's 0.81, but still really relevant and helpful as a screening tool if you're anemic, if you have blood disorders, or if you need to do a out of the clinic assessment, or for a community health worker to do a quick assessment there. So one of the things we did here was the Ministry of Health in Peru reached out to us, where they had a pretty big pandemic where they had a number of their kids in Peru that were anemic. And a lot of this was attributed to malnutrition, access to nutrition. And so they needed to do a massive deployment of how to screen for who would need to get a blood transfusion or who needs to get care. But if you think about the blood draws you'd have to do, and just how you would get those into some of the jungles of Peru, would be very difficult. So on the left is one of my graduate students, who's now Edward Wong, who's now a professor at University of California, San Diego, UCSD. When he was a grad student, was doing this deployment and data collection in Peru to basically do screening using a phone as a tool, so that a community health worker can quickly screen hundreds of patients, where typically it could take much longer than that. If you had a traditional blood draw, take it to the lab, you had to get the lab result back. This is a way to do a triage and then cull it down to the smaller number of individuals that would actually have to get the blood draw. So you can actually, so this is just in the clinic where you can do this massive screening much more effectively. And in fact, you could deploy the app to all the community health workers and do a countrywide assessment very rapidly. And that's always the goal of this project here. So some of the things I'm going to leave you with are just some things that we're working on, just that's relevant, but this early. Obviously fever is a big one for coronavirus. And a lot of people say, why not just get a thermometer? But when you need to get triage, you may not have a thermometer handy. So one thing that turns out on a phone is when you unpack a phone actually has a lot of temperature sensors in it. It's got a set of thermistors for the CPU, for the actual phone itself, for the touchscreen. It's got thermistors for the battery overcharge protection. So there's a lot of temperature sensors in it. In fact, if you look at some of the temperature sensors in a phone, they're the same temperature sensors you might find in a thermometer, like a forehead thermometer. Obviously, they're designed for different uses. But one of the things that we've been looking at is that the thermal mass of the body, if you knew what's operating on the phone, so if you basically only had one app running, or if you controlled what's running on the phone so you can get the temperature at a stable state, and if you put the face of the phone, like on the example here with Joe, who's one of my grad students, on your forehead, you can actually change the thermal mass of the phone, where the heat from the body can actually skew the temperature sensors, because you're at a temperature that is around, if not a little bit lower, but just order of magnitude wise, that you can change the thermal mass of the phone and see all those thermistors pick up that differential. So if you have a fever of 101, 105, or 106, versus if you had a mild grade fever or no fever, you could see those changes. So you don't actually need to get the exact, oh, I'm at 101 or 102. Even a clinical thermometer is not even that great. I mean, even though you might get 0.1 degree Fahrenheit accuracy, so 101 in Fahrenheit, 101.5 in Fahrenheit, it doesn't matter. Are you above a particular number is what matters. And so if you look at over time, the battery temperature has this exponential curve. If you knew the model of what the battery temperature curve was with different processes running in the background, and then you were to quickly change the thermal mass by introducing the body, in this case, the forehead, you can actually see the change off of that baseline. And if that baseline change is much higher than just the natural temperature fluctuation, then you know that you're in a particular grade of fever, because it's just, this differential wouldn't have caused that change. So this is something we're working on now. We're just doing some studies and clinical studies where very rapidly in the field, if you don't happen to have it, this is very important for gig workers that are out in the field. We might not have a thermometer. We just want to be able to self-monitor. Do I have a fever or not? I feel feverish. Quick way of seeing, oh, are you above a threshold or not? And so this could be a way that you can pretty much deploy these on billions of phones if we can get the model to work well. So we're in the midst of doing this work. And this is something, again, we're using a statistical model to model the curve of the actual battery temperature, but also looking at how does that differ when you have somebody with and without a fever. The other area we're looking at is a number of deep learning techniques on interpreting rapid diagnostic tests. So this is not directly doing a screen, but this is where you might have a lateral flow assay where you might have a malaria test. The one on the right are some of these COVID rapid diagnostic tests that are being developed, where you might take a sputum or you might take a nasal swab, put the specimen on this little strip, and the strip changes color, kind of like a pregnancy test. It'll change color, and then you have to assess it. The problem is these lines are faint. Sometimes you can't really interpret them. So we've been building these open source tools that you can take a picture of a malaria strip or even a coronavirus strip, and it basically interprets it for you. So you have an objective measure so that, is that line too faint? Is it dark enough? We try to create an objective measure to see, okay, is this diagnostic or not? And because there's a lot of human error in interpretation, it's surprising. It's like, oh, it's just a color change. It's a line or not. But it turns out it's actually very difficult, because a lot of the gray area is the important area, because if it's very obvious that you're infected or not, but in the middle area, am I or am I not? That's where we have to be very objective. So we have a number of mobile health NGOs that are using some of our tools now to basically deploy in their region malaria, or even now there's starting to be coronavirus strips that are being developed to be able to do very rapid diagnostic tests where you go into the community, do a diagnostic test, and you quickly take a picture of these tests to get them into the database, but also overread them very rapidly as well. I'll leave you with this project that's been going on for a while, where this is another sensor. This is instead of the camera or the microphone, this is the accelerometer and gyro. And you might think, well, what can you do with an accelerometer and gyro? In this case, we're trying to do bone density. So osteoporosis is basically a reduction in density over time. So if you look at the bottom left, healthy bone is dense. If you think about a piece of wood, it's a fairly dense piece of wood. But osteoporotic bones, if you think about a piece of wood that has that has hollowed out, or you have these holes in them, then the bones get brittle. And so one of the things that we had a hypothesis on was we found this paper in the 70s where there's a very clever clinician that basically designed a tuning fork, where you hold a tuning fork that you hold it in your hand and you tap your elbow. And if the tuning fork makes a sound, that means that there was some hollowing happening in your bones. Because if you think about a structure, if you had a solid structure versus a structure that had some hollowing effect to it, the resonance that would get to the tuning fork would change. So the idea was that if I tap my elbow and I create this impulse response, if this thing made a sound, that means there's something happening with my bones. And we're like, oh, interesting. We could actually probably do this with a phone. If you think about a modern phone, the accelerometer and gyro can be sampled at over 1,000 hertz, a kilohertz. And now you can start to get these high frequencies that you can capture these small vibrations at a broad band to basically say, could we replicate the tuning fork experiment? And so the way that this works is you take the phone, you squeeze it in your hand, or you can actually put it up against maybe the tibia on your leg. and then you can use a little impulse where you maybe put an impulse on the tibia. So you basically create a little resonance. You can either tap your elbow or use a little a medical hammer to basically create a impulse, and then you look at what gets to the phone, because you've got the natural shaking that might happen, but then you get these small resonances that occur. So if you look at the spectrogram, a healthy bone and an osteoporotic bone, a healthy bone, you get this sub 400 hertz resonances. You've got this solid structure, you've got these resonances that occur that are still ringing. But when you have an osteoporotic bone, those low frequencies go away, because now you've got the higher frequencies going through, because you've got this hollowed effect. And so you've got these higher frequencies going through and lower frequencies going away. So algorithmically, you can either use a very simple threshold here, or you can just use any conventional CNN to basically do image recognition on just the spectrogram if you wanted to identify that, hey, there's high frequency components here, this one doesn't. And then again, just like a lot of these previous techniques, you don't have to get into an actual number. You can just see, because osteoporosis doesn't instantly happen. It happens over the course of time, many months, years. So if you had a sample once a month, then you can actually see when something's happening. But you don't have to worry about conventional techniques that require X-rays. So a lot of this is done using X-rays, and you're not going to get an X-ray every week or every month. And so here you can use a non-invasive way of potentially measuring bone density. So this is just a quick overview of, it's not just the microphone and speaker or the camera and the flash. You can also use accelerometer and gyro in unique ways. And there's others that use accelerometer gyros for other things as well, like for looking at monitoring heartbeats, and there's other things you can do with it as well. But this is just one example with bone density. So one thing I want to leave you with is that, what does this space open up with? One of the things that's really interesting now is the regulatory space. Regulating a medical device is fairly straightforward. You have this device, you control how it's designed and developed, you do a clinical study, you validate it, and then you have this how do you regulate an app? That's very different, because there's no device. The device is a ubiquitous thing like a phone. So regulating an app, a software as a medical device, is an area that's emerging in the United States and even worldwide. And how do you regulate an AI algorithm? And so I've been in the midst of doing a lot of that work, but it's an interesting one, where if you think about some of the if you look at explainable AI, explainability, if you look at some of those techniques are going to be very important, because from a regulatory standpoint, you've got to have a sense of how does the thing work that you're trying to develop. You've got to have some physiological basis here. But I think the world is going to be heading in a direction where you may not need that, but I think that is really needed for the safety and trust of these things. The other area is around safety and trust, is that the reaction you often get for apps is that, oh, apps are cheap. They're designed to be free or $1 and cheap. And so there's this perception that those are inaccurate. And that's a really tough one, because apps are not supposed to be high quality, but in fact, apps can be pretty high quality, because you get more continuous data. The apps can be updated more frequently. And so there's this perception issue. The other one is around trust in general. A lot of the technology that we've developed, allows you to do monitoring at home. But what happens if the data isn't secure, or if the data doesn't reside in places where the user doesn't have control? So all the work that we've done, the user has complete control over it. The data is local, it's on their device, they can delete it. They decide on when to send it to a physician or a clinician. It's all on device and being done locally there. And so you're consenting to it. But if you think about some of these things, the passive nature of some of these things, you got to really consider what you can do with some of that. Like for example, is in the cough work, we're looking at technology to identify when somebody might have, pulmonary issues, but somebody could actually take that same technology and potentially identify, oh, from that cough, you had coronavirus or didn't have coronavirus. I mean, you can't quite do that yet. That technology doesn't exist, but just think about the things that could be done with the technology. So we have to think very creatively and carefully about the unintended consequences of some of these things. It's making it easier for developing healthcare for everybody in the world. But at the same time, there's some things that it makes easier for people to identify that may not be as intended as we thought we wanted. The patient-provider relationship completely changes. Now you're empowering an individual with tools, or community health workers with tools that typically the clinicians had access to those tools. So that conversation between the clinician, the provider, and the patient changes a little bit. Now the data, now the individual has more of it and more access to it, and so that relationship changes. The other one that we're starting to see more and more of that we're inking as much as we can out of these sensors. And it's actually helping inform new medical devices. Instead of thinking of it from a traditional way of developing a heart rate monitor, a blood pressure monitor, now you have these other ways of developing maybe even lower cost devices. Now, if you've made innovations and breakthroughs with these phone-based solutions, it can actually drive innovation in medical devices that are even lower cost that could be used in the clinical setting. And finally, I just want to leave, a lot of this talk was around diagnostics and screening and tools for collecting data, but I just want to point out that that's just a small sliver of what we can do and what we need to do. Many of the problems that are pervasive worldwide are social determinants of health. And what I mean by social determinants is where you live, access to water, safe water, nutrition. There's a lot of other things that we can do that can have a major impact on healthcare. In the United States, the zip code typically is actually one of the bigger predictors of mortality or just health and wellness, just your zip code where you live. So the environment, the around you, the support structures you have, the infrastructure has a big impact on your healthcare as well. So just diagnostics and screening isn't going to solve the problem. I just want to call out that social determinants are just as important, if not even more important. And in fact, mobile could have a role there as well. So this is, my talk has been focused on screening, but mobile has a lot more impact that it can have on social determinants. So I'd like to end with just thanking all my current graduate students, current students, past students, students that have all gone off to bigger and better things as professors, thought leaders in industry. So just want to thank them. A lot of this work, all of this work was done by my students. I just had the honor of passing along this information. These are the folks that did all the hard work and have actually started to revolutionize healthcare through some of these techniques. So credit goes to them, not me. I'm just, like I said, I'm just a conduit of the work that they're doing. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you for your attention. Hopefully this was helpful and inspirational to all of you. But what I would like to leave you with is that computer science can have an incredible impact on society. Healthcare is a place with the current pandemic, with coronavirus, there's unprecedented things that are happening, and computing is playing a critical across the board there, and it's only going to increase. So I think there's an amazing opportunity for computing to really change the world, and it is changing the world right now. So thank you. I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah, so please submit your questions. Giannis will help triage and try to consolidate questions and pass them along to me. So
great. There are a bunch of questions that have been placed, and I'll start with one that appears and brings in various versions. People have talked about privacy. So how do we deal with privacy in this new paradigm of essentially personal health care? How do we, many of the things that were discussed are done server-based. Are we going to see some shift of all this happening on the phone itself? What do you say about that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One of the things I pointed out is a lot of the work that we've done has primarily can be done on device. So I think one of the shifts that we're seeing is as we're seeing things like federated learning, as we start to see on-device compute, these binarized neural nets that are being developed, most of the work that I've showed you can actually do on device. And I think a push towards on device is one way. You actually don't need to do a lot of this stuff in the server. So that's one area. The other thing is I think we just need to fundamentally think about privacy here in general. And I think one of the things is that, and that's something that we often think about in our group, is looking at the unintended consequences. So, as I mentioned, the cough was an interesting example of that, where, the goal here is to actually have an impact in healthcare, where we want to be able to identify, cases that are happening where there's an exacerbation or helping you with your own healthcare. But if that data is can be used in a completely different way. So if you think about health insurance, if somebody has access to that data, they could probably use the cough to identify that you might have a condition that might not have been self-reported, and health insurance companies could use that. So I think one of the things that we have to do is, as this area is still fairly early and nascent, we have to ask those questions and build those things into the technology. So one is, as I mentioned, on device, focusing on device. The other ones that we worked on is that there's ways to actually build these networks and these algorithms in such a way that you can't reconstruct the original source of the data. So for example, one of the things you can do is you can compute the statistics. So the cough doesn't go anywhere, the sound doesn't go anywhere, it stays on your phone. But what it generates are the statistics around cough frequency, cough intensity, those kinds of things. But the original audio won't be analyzed because it's not even available there. But if you took the statistics, or if you took some of the features that came out of it, maybe it's the embeddings or anything like that, and you try to reconstruct it, you can't get back to the original data. So there's ways to basically get the things that you need from a statistical, physiological standpoint, but can never be reconstructed. And these are all technological solutions, obviously, but I think there's a fundamental privacy data governance set of considerations that we just need to take into account, just because these are emerging technologies that we don't often think about.
Excellent. One other question, actually, set of questions that deal with the same thing is, what about accuracy? You mentioned in your talk that you don't have to be completely accurate. It's like the devices in hospitals and clinics and so on.
Yeah.
But still, you need some accuracy, some level of certification, some level of confidence.
That's right.
How do you address this?
Yeah. And luckily, so with some of the work that we've been doing, the accuracy is actually pretty good. In fact, some of it is getting very close to the clinical devices, and maybe even getting some of those things regulated just as a clinical device. And in fact, the accuracy is not the problem right now. So as I said, I think you don't have to be perfect, because even clinical devices aren't perfect. If you go into a clinic with a spirometer, you could have a major error or difference. When you capture my blood pressure, if I go in, if I happen to cross my legs, or if I'm nervous, you're going to get an inaccurate result. That's why you take multiple measurements, right? Now, if you have multiple measurements at home with a device that's not as perfectly accurate, you can still use the longitudinal trending information. But what you can do is have a different lens on the accuracy. So when you look at your sensitivity specificity curves, what you want to look at is not just that correlation. How accurate is that correlation? But what you want to look at is, where do you have your limits of agreement? Or where do you have your cutoffs in terms of where you have a threshold that says that, hey, I need to take the next step versus. And so when you have those kinds of metrics, then you could get to very high accuracy. In other words, you don't miss anybody that might have a condition that's arising. So you have very high sensitivity specificity with a threshold saying that, hey, everybody that does this maneuver, we basically capture that they have some pulmonary ailment happening, and you don't miss a lot of people. So because the problem is, you don't need to get to clinical grade there. You just need to get to a case where you know who to focus on and who to triage. But as I mentioned earlier, sometimes accuracy is not because of the technical reasons, it's because of the technique reasons. So for spirometry, some people might hold the phone wrong. They might blow not hard enough. They might not keep their mouth open. I might hold the finger wrong. And so when I have a telemedicine visit, luckily the triage nurse on the other end of the telemedicine call can say, hey, hold it this way, we're getting a better signal. So many of the things that we found actually become human-computer interaction problems or opportunities where helping them do the technique better increases the accuracy too. And compliance is the other one. You're actually doing it often enough and those kinds of things. But yeah, so I think we're in the midst of a kind of a paradigm shift in the regulatory space with the FDA, in the United States and other regulatory bodies around the world, looking at, well, how do we regulate some of this stuff? You're already starting to see AI models that are being FDA cleared. So we're just slowly moving into that space. But I think my worry has been in this space, if everybody tries to get to the perfect clinical accuracy, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot, because we're attaining a goal that you might not need to always get to. Then people might not be innovating in a space because it's impossible to get to that sensitivity specificity. Whereas something over here may actually be good enough if you think about it, right? So that's the thing. It's just to have a broad perspective on what are the actual accuracies you need to go after. You just don't have to be, you don't have to use the clinical standard or clinical devices as your gold standard all the time.
Privacy, accuracy, and now another concept, equity.
Yeah.
Not everyone has a smartphone.
Yeah.
Even if you have a smartphone, you don't have the last model that can take all these goodies. Yep. How do we serve the entire world?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And one of the things, and that's something that, when I mentioned the spiral call work, early on we said, so we often use so if it can't work on the smartphone, it's not going to work on an older generation phone. So what we try to do is try to do our prototyping early on to see, is it even feasible? If we can't even get good data with a modern phone, then it's going to be really tough to get it with some of the older phones. With Spirosmart, we were getting good data. We said, hey, let's start to look at these feature phones. So that one was a phone that didn't even have apps on it, right? You could basically call a 1-800 number and you just use text messaging, which a lot of those phones had. So one of the things that we've been pushing on is that as you start to develop some of these models, you have to look at, don't lock yourself in with the computational capabilities of a phone that's only 5 years old. We'll take a broader perspective. But I agree. I think one of the things is that is you have to kind of look at a broad set of phones, but the smartphones right now that we develop on is just a way to prototype and to validate, is this even possible? And then we try to develop these techniques where, again, it doesn't have to be perfect for some of these things, as long as you can use it as a triage tool. So the spiral call work is an example of that, where we said, hey, we're going to go through the overhead of analyzing this audio data that's going through all these different networking and telephony connections. And at the end of it, it's not going to sound like the thing that I would have locally recorded on the phone, but what can you do with that? So I think going in with that as a first principle and adding that constraint in from the get-go makes a big difference, because the moment you don't make that fundamental mental shift is that you have the luxury of using a smartphone, and you will never go, it would be so difficult to unwind some of that. But if you add those constraints in early, that's really helpful. The other thing that I've been really pushing on is if you can demonstrate on a modern smartphone what you can and can't do, then as these lower cost phones are being developed globally, you know what to focus on, right? So you have new phones that are developed, there are smartphones that are lower cost, but they make trade-offs, right? To get to that price point, oh, we're gonna reduce the resolution of the camera. We're only gonna put one microphone, or we're not gonna pick this microphone. But now what we can do is inform handset manufacturers, hey, focus on these things and cut these things down, so that now this phone can be helpful for telephony, communication, micropayments, payments, and healthcare. Right now, a handset manufacturer doesn't have a clue, like, oh, what microphone should I pick for health? But at least we can help cull that down to say, if you only have this much budget from a bill of material standpoint to build a $5, $10, $20 phone, here's what we could help inform the design of the phone. That's the other thing we could do, is moving forward, as these low-cost phones are developed, we can make sure that the right things get put in them.
Great. Another set of questions now moves away from the technology itself, but how do you communicate all these techniques, all these tools to the healthcare providers? How do you make them believe in them, use them, engage them into the healthcare system?
Yeah, it's a really tough. Yeah, it's a very tough one. Luckily, a lot of my collaborators have been fairly kind of open to technology and change. But the healthcare industry, unfortunately, is very slow. It's very entrenched. A lot of things that are common knowledge or dogma now may not even be accurate, but still that's the going standards right now. So there's been a couple of different ways that we've been trying to prove this out. One is we do the clinical studies, as I showed. As a computer scientist, my group does a lot of clinical studies. I mean, if you look at the kinds of things we do, it's like, is he a computer scientist? Is he a clinician? Is he a bioengineer? For me, it doesn't matter. I'm a scientist. I'm trying to help the world. But computing is, the core of what I do in a lot of these areas. So one is being able to do rigorous clinical studies that healthcare professionals understand. And so that's one. The other one is we actually take a lot of this stuff to the next level to do outcome studies. And what I mean by outcome studies, when you start to deploy this technology in an intervention or a treatment to show how well this works. So what we've done is in the United States, it's really tough to do this because our healthcare system is entrenched and very slow to change sometimes. So we've been partnering with the Gates Foundation for almost a decade now, where we deploy a lot of our technologies in developing countries and emerging markets, because they don't often have an entrenched system. They have a lot more flexibility in terms of innovating and maybe even leapfrog North America or Europe in terms of the kinds of technologies they can develop, where they, just like landlines, right? Landlines didn't exist in many of these regions. They went straight to mobile and cellular. So you completely leapfrog this whole telephony network in the same way that we can leapfrog these kind of systems that don't work well right now and just move. So the way that we can prove a lot of these things out is go to regions where you might have these extreme phenotypes. So extreme cases where you might have a lot of tuberculosis, you might have a lot of pulmonary issues, where you have wood burning stove and those kinds of things. And very quickly we can validate, hey, here's the efficacy of this stuff, and then bring that back to clinicians to say, hey, look, here's the kind of impact we're having. So you've got to be really kind of opportunistic in terms of where you would deploy it, how you deploy it. But also, I think you have to show the efficacy, which is really tough as a computer scientist. And that's why a lot of computer science researchers don't go down this path, is that, you have to be in it for the long haul. And that's one of the challenges here.
One other very interesting question that we have is that many of the things, even in current healthcare, is about correcting diseases. But how about preventing diseases?
Yeah.
Can this technology that you have it all the time with you, you sleep with it, can increase the level of early detection?
Yes.
On its own, so to speak, without you going after and looking for something.
And that's really the crux of a lot of this notion of continuous monitoring, which is pre-symptomatically, so asymptomatic, before you're symptomatic, could you identify something that's happening? Like a concrete example is coronavirus. So if we knew that you had coronavirus before you're symptomatic, then you can protect yourself, obviously, by doing the right measures, but you also protect everybody else, because even pre-symptomatic, you're a spreader. You're also infecting others. Influenza, flu is the same thing. Before you're symptomatic, actually, when you're symptomatic, your viral load is actually going down. Your viral load was going up before you had the fever and the aches. And in fact, you were more infectious then. So there's a lot of value in that. Pancreatic cancer, as I showed. So the idea here is that because we have the ability, if we had wearables and mobile and these kinds of devices, is you see the changes in your physiology. That's an indicator. This is where computer science has a unique role it can play, is that pattern matching work and that AI work is absolutely critical, because we don't know in clinical science, like, what are those signals that are precursors? But now if you think about the ubiquity of the phone, if you have the clinical outcome, you have the sensor data from the phone, now you have this massive data set where you can start to do predictive modeling a priori before you're symptomatic. Like this is, so there's a huge possibility there. But that's one of the goals here. The other thing I want to point out is that, there's a couple things. There's one is managing your disease. So if you have been infected or you have a disease, mobile health can help you manage your treatment. If you have tuberculosis, if it's getting worse or not, pre-symptomatic. But the other one is, some things are societal driven. Just because if you have a certain condition doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It just means that society isn't adapted for your needs. So technology can also play a role to adapt to your needs, so you can interface with society too. So I think there's three roles it plays. One is triage in the healthcare space. One is that you might have a chronic disease that you can't cure, but you have to use the mobile tool as a way to interface with society, because it's not built around individuals that might have certain conditions. And then the third is treatment, basically being able to monitor how well your treatment is going. So I think those are the three areas.
This is great. Unfortunately, time flies. We have tens of questions that we wouldn't be able to ask and get an answer. But let me finish with one of the last comments that came to the chat, and I really I'm completely in sync with it. Real scientists are altruistic. Thank you very much, Mr. Patel. On behalf of everyone, thanks a lot, Shwetak. This was amazing.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Of course, if anyone there could be more written answers to your questions offline, and that you can see that, but we're at our time limit. So thank you again, and thank you all for participating. Goodbye.
Thank you, Yannis, very much for the excellent job moderating and handling all those questions. And thank you to Shwetak as well for an amazing talk. I don't think I'll ever look at this device as a phone ever again. It's just something new to me. That was truly amazing. And it's a pity we ran out of time. And but I think the amount of questions is testament to the interest in your topic. So again, thank you to Yannis as a moderator, Shwetak as a keynote amazing talk. And also thank you to the participants for all of your questions. And following that, I'd like to make a few announcements for next week. We're looking forward to a very action-packed week. We have 3 webinars next week. And on Tuesday, the 13th of July, we'll be having what is considered part 2 of the breakthrough session on the future of food. So if you're interested in that topic, please tune in. And on Wednesday, on the 14th of July, we'll be having a session from curated by AI for Africa, and promises to be very interesting as well. And on the 15th of July, we'll be having the launch of the Global Data Pledge. And there's a special guest who will be joining on board. The Nobel Peace Prize winner, Mohamed Yunus, will be speaking as well during that session. So I'd like to encourage you to attend all of them, or one or many. It's up to you, depending on your topic of interest. And my colleagues have been pasting all of the links to these sessions in the chat, so you can go and register directly so you don't miss out on anything. Last but not least, I'd like to highlight the fact that 2 years ago, because of the AI for Good Global Summit, we launched a focus group on AI and health with the World Health Organization. And the goal of the group is to basically develop a benchmarking framework for the testing, evaluation, and efficacy of AI for health algorithms and applications. So I'm assuming if you're here today, you're probably quite interested in that topic. They'll be having their 10th meeting mid-September online. It's an open meeting. Anyone can join. So I would encourage you as well to go in the chat and click on the link if you want to join that focus group, and then meet with like-minded folks in mid-September to continue this important work. So with that, we've reached the end. All good things must come to an end. I'd like to once again thanks the speakers, the panelists, the moderator, the participants, and of course ACM, the gold sponsor of the summit for many years in a row now, and also sponsoring this keynote. Thanks again to ACM, Vicky, and Shwetak, much appreciated, and also our co-convener, Switzerland. And with that, I say goodbye and hope to see many of you next week. Thank you.